Hi, everybody. For this week's discussion, I'll be presenting on the Scopes trial of 1925. Just a little bit of background. The trial began in July of 1925 in the small town of Dayton, Tennessee. It featured major national figures like William Jennings Bryan and James Dower, both attorneys, but coming from completely opposite worldviews. Bryan was an ardent Christian, self-proclaimed fundamentalist who believed in the inerrancy of the Bible, including the creation story. Darrow, however, was a proclaimed agnostic with what appears to be atheistic hostility towards Christianity during the trial, and did not hold to a biblical worldview in the least, as you will see or can see in the interviews and cross-examination of Bryan. What started as a local trial became a national spectacle. I believe that was intentional, and if you read some of the histories following what came out, it seems to be the case that it was intentional to bring light to this idea of teaching evolution in public education. Tennessee had something called the Butler Act, which outlawed the teaching of evolution. So something interesting about that, the textbook used in the classroom within Dayton had sections on evolution. So they had a book that they had okayed with something that was outlawed. And so that was brought to light and isn't really addressed much. You don't really hear much about that, but it's true. The other thing that's not really mentioned about the Scopes trial, because it focused so much on Bryan and Darrow, is that of Scopes himself. The teacher wasn't actually a biology teacher. He was a substitute. He used the textbook very briefly, but also he was an ardent evolutionist and eugenicist, where he believed that the Caucasoid race was the premier race. So an incredibly racist young man. But of course, that is not going to be something that is going to be focused on. Some of the headlines produced in the newspapers at the time were nearly word for word, which is really nice. It gives us an exact idea of what was exchanged verbatim between the witnesses and the attorneys. Most of the popular exchanges between Bryan and Darrow, when they did that cross-examination, when Bryan was like, yeah, I'll be your witness. And a lot of people are like, bro, you shouldn't have done that. But he professed to be an expert on the Bible, and so it was allowed to continue. Other themes of the papers, when you find them on the databases, focused on the literal translation, which Bryan espoused, and thus the fundamentalists espoused, because that was the whole point, the fundamentalists versus the modernists, and how that made them look like bigots or anti-science because they're not listening to Darwinian theory, evolution, long ages, which came up and kind of sweep the feet under Bryan because of his acknowledgement that Genesis could allow for long amounts of time. The case rather provided a spotlight on the beliefs of fundamentalists at the time. Even though Bryan opened up that can of worms with regards to the age of the earth, fundamentalists as a whole, Bryan as the face of the fundamentalists, agreed with a literal interpretation of Genesis, a literal interpretation of Scripture. At the end, Scopes was convicted, fined. However, the charges were dropped when it went to the Supreme Court of Tennessee because of some technicalities, and so he was never formally charged. Nothing ever stood. While the fundamentalist movement was growing and would continue to do so through the 1950s, the choice of Bryan to be an expert when he wasn't a scientist, when he wasn't a theologian, ended up creating a hiccup for the public's greater understanding of Christians and that whole idea. Good for Bryan. However, Proverbs 13:3 teaches, right? Sometimes it's wiser to keep quiet than to prevent any ruin to oneself or others. It's personal interest to me. It's one of the reasons why I got a geoscience major. And so I hope this proved a little tidbit interesting to you. I hope you have a wonderful week. Good luck on your papers. And I hope you have a wonderful week. Bye.